I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to find order in our mad world.
And this week, we're going to look at India's role in the world. India is the birthplace of many of the world's great cultures, the founding place of Buddhism, the center of Hinduism, also a home to hundreds of millions of Muslims. For all who've been, India is a place of stunning scenery, historic monuments. Then there's the modern aspects like Bollywood, world-class cricket, and really some of the best engineering and computer schools in the entire world. I have some issues and problems with the role that India plays in 21st century geopolitics, but there's no debating that India is a rising great power. So, does India have an ordering role in the world? It certainly has a unique position. Since 1947, India has resisted being aligned with any geopolitical camp. It's always wanted to retain strategic autonomy, to avoid being treated as a junior partner by either of the major superpowers. So today, we're going to look at Indian foreign policy and to debate, is India at present an orderer? Or is it a neopopulist disorderer? Or is it something in between and different?
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a wonderful way to frame India's complexity. Now, I actually was posted to India, so I got to know it fairly well from the years 2006 to 2007. And in my view, India is a country that just defies description. It's an incredibly frustrating country to work in and to deal with. And the UK is experiencing some of the frustrations of dealing with India today as it's struggling to conclude a post-Brexit free trade deal with India. India can also disappoint. It's a democracy, and it's an aspirant to be a member of the UN Security Council. So in theory, it should be an active upholder of international standards and values. But it's been very reluctant to criticize Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, and it's been willing to buy discounted Russian oil despite global sanctions on Russia. India says it's not anti-Western, but its membership of BRICS, the association of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that's now been expanded to include Iran and a few other countries, brings it into association with quite a few countries that very definitely are anti-Western. And then on the domestic side, India's current leader, Narendra Modi, is a very divisive, controversial figure, given his explicit embrace of Hindutva or Hinduness as the overriding ideology of his government. This is a problematic concept given India's very pluralistic, diverse community. You also talked about India's desire to retain its strategic autonomy on the world stage. But even there, I would say the picture is slightly shifting. It is true that during the Cold War, India positioned itself firmly within the non-aligned movement, but that didn't stop it in practice developing an extremely close defense relationship with Russia, not least because it needed Russian weapons in response to China's support for India's arch rival Pakistan. But even while it maintains that strong defense relationship with Russia, India has been developing an increasingly strong security and economic relationship with the US as well. Amazingly, the US is now India's top trading partner at over $130 billion in goods, and Delhi is Washington's eighth largest trading partner. India is a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, shorthand known as the Quad, with the US, Australia, and Japan, a platform for working together to address regional security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, which, although it's not explicitly acknowledged, the subtext is the threat from rising China. And what really unlocked the potential of the US-India relationship was this historic deal signed in 2006 between the US and India, whereby the US agreed to share nuclear technology and allow India to develop a peaceful nuclear program. And on the back of that transformational decision, the US and India have become ever closer together on economic and security issues. So, this is a very complicated and nuanced set of relationships that India has. And then finally, I would say not all India's criticisms of the West are entirely without merit. When you look at, for example, our failed intervention in Iraq or our messy withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's not entirely unfair to criticize us of double standards towards certain authoritarian regimes or our current rather confused stance on Israel and Gaza. In fact, the idea that as a democracy, India should automatically align itself with the traditional Western powers, arguably that smacks a little bit of colonialism. So it's a confusing country both to understand and to deal with. What do you think, Jason?
Confused is a very good word to use about India, Alex. For anyone who's ridden a tuk-tuk around Delhi or tried to get from Shillong into the Naga Hills, you know that this isn't just a civilization, it's many civilizations teeming with life and chaos, a huge amount of economic vibrancy. But what I feel is that these days, the current state of India is a mirror of all the problems of the enduring disorder. It turns out that recent studies published by Time magazine that we're going to post to in the show notes reveal that income inequality in India today is worse than during the height of the British colonial period. And to my mind, it should come as no surprise to our listeners that the more I've studied Modi, and when I went to India and when I read books about it, I came to feel that Modi is a typical neopopulist strongman. He has no real solutions to the problems facing his country other than playing up sectarian antagonisms between Muslims and Hindus and seeking to partner with like-minded strongmen abroad. Modi champions human rights, supposedly. He supposedly says that he is a champion of the anti-colonial causes and of BRICS. But then he has a bromance with Putin, and he has a decade-long embrace, not just of Israel, but of Bibi Netanyahu himself personally, and the Israeli hard right in specific. He incited ethnic violence when he was governor of Gujarat. India today might represent a post-democracy where America might be headed, where Hungary already has been, where a democracy has already given way to a post-democratic, consolidated, neo-populist authoritarianism where the media has been consolidated by oligarchs and wealthy tycoons utilize a low tax rate and access to the ruler to have their interests protected. But we need to say Modi is not India. India is a place of tremendous opportunity. We think about Indian entrepreneurs, Indian coders, Indian writers, Indian doctors, philosophers. They're really among the best and brightest in the world. So we have to think about a very complex moment for India and the Indian diaspora as Modi has tried to really radicalize this community.
Yeah, so Jason, I agree. Modi isn't India, but he is the current face of India. And what I find most extraordinary is that when I was in New Delhi, at that time, Modi was on a banned travel list to the UK and to the US because of the perception of his involvement in the brutal pogrom of Muslims in the state of Gujarat, where he was chief minister at the time. And I remember traveling to Gujarat during my time in India and meeting some of the Muslims who were affected by that pogrom, and their stories were simply horrendous, and there was no accountability for what happened. And so Modi, for me, because of that experience when I was actually in India at that time, that legacy still hangs over him today, from my point of view. And even when I was in India 17, 18 years ago, I always felt there was a tension between what was going on inside India and the India that I saw when I traveled to the small villages, the continuing problems of the treatment of women, sexual violence, caste, discrimination against Muslims, the harassment of minorities, the violence of the police who were accused of taking part frequently in extrajudicial killings. They would call them encounter killings. Oh, we were going after this criminal and he died in an encounter. All these things existed 20 years ago. I think the new element that has happened under Modi is there is a much more concerted effort to attack India's institutions. There are now quite consistent efforts to suppress and intimidate NGOs, student activists, media, take control of the judiciary. And then there is this very overt sectarian Hindu ideology, which I think is immensely divisive and dangerous. India was this fantastic pluralist country. So I don't like what's going on inside India. And I think it's very dangerous and it risks poisoning Indian society from within. But there is another story to Modi, and this is the outward face of Modi that he presents to the West as having led this transformation of India, of creating this technology and digital revolution, of developing dialogues and taking part in summits and international events and putting India on the world stage. So I think there's these sort of two conflicting narratives. I wanted, in my interview with our guest today, to get a sense, how does the world look from where India sits? We're sitting here in judgment on how India looks to us, but I wanted to get a sense, but if you're an Indian looking outwards, how does it look from where you sit in Delhi? So our guest today is Indrani Bagchi, someone I got to know very well during my posting when she was one of India's most respected foreign policy journalists, as associate editor for the Times of India, and she's now the chief executive officer of the Ananta Centre. But I began our interview by asking her to bring me up to speed. How has India changed in the 17 years since I was posted there? And in particular on the domestic front in the run-up to India's forthcoming general elections.
India is, I'd say, a more technology-friendly society. The numbers are pretty staggering. The largest number of people in the planet using smartphones. These things have actually transformed the lives of a lot of India's poor. You know, there is a huge number of people in India who were unbanked and are no longer unbanked. State benefits then started to flow directly into the bank account. The second thing that I would say that's changed has been the Modi government, certainly the last 10 years, really focused a lot on infrastructure. A third thing is the freeing up of technology sectors. That has been important for India as we look for non-China solutions. The fourth thing that has happened and has been, in a way, life-changing has been the politics and the ideology of the Modi government. Its ideology is very much attuned to what I call a Hindu renewal, harking back to a more glorious past of the Hindu with a more technologically friendly future.
Modi gets extremely high approval ratings despite this political marginalization of particularly the Muslims. But his ratings are sort of in the 80s, which implies actually that quite a lot of the Muslim population are willing to vote for him.
Remember a couple of things. One, the Muslim is not a consolidated vote. There's some part of the Muslim population, for instance, in Gujarat, the Bora Muslim community, very much as a Modi BJP supporter. women have grown to become more distinct political entity. When the Modi government outlawed this triple talaq, which is a Muslim man can divorce his wife by just uttering the word 3 times, it brought a number of Muslim women as quiet voters. The welfare has been a big part of this journey for women as well from other communities. Access to water near the house rather than having to walk 5 kilometers has changed voting patterns.
And access to toilets.
That was the first thing that he did, which was, stop the open defecation, building toilets. That has been transformative particularly for women. So the growth of women as a political vote bank has been a big part of Modi's politics.
So from what you've been describing, Modi has reshaped India's social and economic and political aspects. He's offered a different kind of vision. He's modernized. He's built infrastructure. He's introduced a technical revolution. And he's offering a different kind of future for the country. So we have the elections, the world's biggest elections, the world's longest elections, I think, taking place over 7 weeks because it's such a vast country. But I think we all think that the BJP is set to win and return to government for a 3rd straight term. What will happen after the elections? What do you think is going to be Modi's next step or the party's next step? How will it influence India's politics and policies for the next 5 years?
Modi's started a number of projects, mostly in the technology sphere, bringing manufacturing back into the Indian economy, diversify supply chains away from China. Added to this is the fact that if you look at India, this is a moment of vulnerability, of an acknowledgement of vulnerability, of our dependence on Russia. And then our defense challenges have increased enormously. So if you look around the country today, we are building more naval bases, building more warships, aircraft, drones than we have ever done. So yes, I think this process of transformation is going to continue.
When I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking a lot about how we viewed India and why does India do this? Why does it maintain its relationship with Russia? Why hasn't it been more outspoken on Ukraine? And I realized this is very much a Western prism of looking at India and why isn't India doing our bidding? So I'm going to actually reframe the way I had intended to run the interview and instead ask you to give our listeners a sense of how do we look to India? How does our handling of issues like Ukraine or the Middle East or our withdrawal from Afghanistan, how is India interpreting all of that? How does the world look from India's point of view? And where does India want to sit within that world?
In India, there is that sense of Western hypocrisy. You want to say that Modi is dictatorial, yet you've had no problems with Arab sheikhs, with the Pakistani generals, even with China. I mean, China did not one morning wake up and decide to become the bad guy in the room. China was bidding fair to become the bad guy in the room for at least 3 decades prior. But it was just convenient for the West to outsource everything to China. I mean, there are people in India who would remember that from 2005 onwards until, say, 2017, we have been lectured that you can't get your act together because here are you, one big piece of chaos. And look at the Chinese, look at where they've gone. Why can you not be more like China? Now have a leader who isn't like China, certainly, but much more forceful than the ones that we've had before. And then you turn around and say, this man is a dictator. So there is that sense of, yeah, right, we've heard this before. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, we thought that it was terrible for America's image, and that was not good for us because we worried at the time not about the withdrawal, but about the nature of withdrawal and whether that would open up space for the Chinese and the Pakistanis to present a bigger threat to India. About Russia and Ukraine, there are many Indians who believe that NATO should not have expanded eastwards in the way that it did without keeping Russian sensitivities in play. Nobody in India condoned the invasion. Russia has always been one of the first responders when India has needed assistance. The West never did. So we are definitely not going to openly criticize Russia, which remains the largest by far supplier of defense equipment and military platforms for India, particularly when we have a live conflict situation on two of our borders.
I mean, I think this Russia-Ukraine debate is really interesting because I think the assumption of so many of us in Western capitals is, but India is a democracy, and this sort of democracy and values-based foreign policy should be what takes precedence. And now you have spelled out quite compellingly, there are sort of very practical consequences for India of the Russia-Ukraine war. But at the end of the day, Russia invaded Ukraine, made a claim on another country's territory in complete violation of the UN Charter. And India has aspirations to join the UN Security Council, but has not explicitly condemned Russia for its actions. So that is, I think, what a lot of us struggle with. And surely it's in all our interests for this war to end. It still looks to me a little bit like India has done what suits India in terms of continuing to try and keep relations open with Russia. But at the end of the day, there's a values proposition here. And you said, some in India criticize NATO's expansion without taking account of Russian sensitivities. But imagine if we in the West drew a map that sort of put a dotted line around disputed territory between China and India, because we should take account of Chinese sensitivities and its claims to Indian land. You'd think that was a bit problematic, wouldn't you?
Perhaps, except that I don't see anybody who has done that. I think the US came closest to condemning Chinese actions on Indian borders, but Chinese actions of creeping loss of sovereignty by creeping encroachment, if you will, has been happening for several years.
So we're guilty of double standards on this. We're expecting you to criticize Russia, but we haven't been as tough on China.
Yeah, but the other thing is, this is frequently held up to India as, you want to be a member of the UN Security Council, you have not condemned Russia. The thing is, if I condemn Russia, I lose Russia. But do I really get into the UN Security Council?
It's almost impossible.
Exactly. So if I'm not going to get into the UN Security Council, why am I going to ruin my own interests and condemn Russia? Instead, at this moment, if you see the fact that Modi is on a call with Putin 1 minute and on a call with Zelensky on another minute, we are using the fact that we can speak to both sides a little more judiciously that people give us credit for.
Since we have a lot of listeners in the UK, what about the India-UK relationship? It's been a bit of a struggle to try and get a UK-India trade deal since Brexit. There's a bit of resistance on the political side in the UK to a deal that opens up immigration for more Indians, which is a key ask, as I understand it, of the Modi government. How's the UK-India relationship these days?
I will say that the Modi government has invested more in the UK than I had given them credit for. We welcomed Brexit. I hate to say this.
Sharp intake of breath.
We were happy with Brexit because it allowed us to separate our relationships.
divide and conquer us. So not necessarily a good decision for us, but one that gave India opportunity.
I think what it did was we saw the UK being a bit of an obstacle in a free trade deal with the Europeans. Brexit made it easier for us to deal with the UK separately because our issues with the UK different from our issues with the Europeans. We've always separated them in our heads, always. Brexit just did it for us. So we were happy with Brexit, although you won't get anybody to say that officially.
But what were the obstacles that the Brits were posing?
The same thing that we are battling about today, which is a movement of professionals across borders. Well, I think we are also arguing about the amount of whiskey that we let in. Indians are producing whiskey. They're producing single malts.
It sounds like it should be a good deal. We sell you a lot of whiskey and we get a lot of your brainiest people. I mean, it should be a win-win.
I think every government would have a little bit of an issue with that. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to get it done before the UK British elections, but I think the effort in the Indian side is definitely to get it done before the Indian elections.
Another one of these incredibly complex set of relationships which India is navigating concerns Israel and the Palestinians, because Israel is part of a quad with countries in the Gulf. You have this Middle East set of relationships. But especially under Modi, India has also become a lot closer to Israel. And in fact, I believe Modi was one of the first world leaders to utterly condemn the Hamas attacks and express huge sympathy for Israel. So how is India navigating the Israel-Gaza situation? And what do you want to see happen there?
We continue to condemn the events of October 7th because in so many different ways, it reminded us of the Mumbai attacks on the 26th of November, 2008. So given our history on terror, we will never not condemn that particular event. However, we also want a statehood for the Palestinians. The two-state solution has been an article of faith for India forever, and we haven't given that up. We don't think the Israelis are doing the right thing, flattening Gaza, because in so many different ways, Hamas doesn't care. Hamas is winning that perception war. People have forgotten the horrors of that day. But we recognize that Israel is a very close friend. There is a level of trust between India and Israel that is not there with many countries. It's a tough one. This war impacts us more than the Russia-Ukraine war, honestly. But in the last 10 years, the countries that we've seriously befriended is the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They are our biggest friends in that region. That's one more bit of something that we have to wrap our heads around.
India is also a player within the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So why is India part of the BRICS? What does it see in this new grouping? What does it hope to achieve there?
We spent many years in the 20th century staying out of groups because we didn't think that our values matched them or that they would serve any purpose. In so many ways, we were the losers. And we would now stay in every group. We are there in the BRICS, we are there in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, why are we there? One, we don't want to be out of the room if they become powerful enough for us to be able to call the shots in any way possible. We want to be a shaper in the BRICS. You bring enough talent to the table to ensure that BRICS doesn't become an engine of Chinese diplomacy or an engine of Russian diplomacy to the extent that it creates this anti-West kind of an alliance. We are not anti-West. And frankly, after the expansion, if you look at the countries that they've brought in, apart from a couple of them, they're not anti-West either. So everybody is hedging And we are all part of this big global hedging exercise.
I mean, this is a very sophisticated and complicated foreign policy. You've got your relationship with China, your biggest strategic rival in the Pacific. You have Russia and the US. You have developed networks with the Middle East. You hosted the G20 last year and developed this idea of this regional corridor linking India, the Middle East to Europe. This is a very sophisticated and complicated foreign policy that India is navigating. So, what kind of world does India want to see?
I'd say we talk a little bit about India being a member of the UN Security Council. We recognize that that's not going to happen in the present system. But we see a world which is not a hub and spoke system, the hub being the US or the West and the spokes being everybody else. We see a number of different poles, India being one of the poles. And the first thing we would like to see is Asia being more multipolar, which basically means that we would counter all efforts at Chinese hegemony. The world that we see coming is much more fluid and much less certain, being less rigid, about being more flexible, about partners. We don't see the world as being a settled project any longer.
After the break, is India an orderer or a disorderer? That was a very clear-eyed, hard-nosed portrayal of India's position in the world, and I'd like to thank Indrani for it. However, as good a portrayal as it was, there's a lot to dislike there. I am shocked to hear that the official Indian position is trying to benefit from Brexit.
I know. You heard my reaction to that. I couldn't believe it.
I think Indrani is, again, hats off to her for her honesty, because Britain's weakness and the coordination problems between Britain and Europe do make it easier for other powers, such as India, to have greater leverage in trade negotiations with Britain. And the very notion that Britain can get a better deal if it's cut free from Brussels is clearly exposed. That kind of hit me in my gut, Alex. But maybe the most cynical or depressing part of the interview was Indrani's apology of or justification of India's desire to hedge between Russia and Ukraine. I accept Modi's policy is going to have to deal with both, but I don't like and I don't accept the idea that it's principled. Trying to say, we need to take into concern the fact that NATO did a lot of expansion eastward after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it's like, no, that's not the basis for a legitimate policy. It's a talking point. But you got to give it to Modi in the portrayal that Indrani gave us. He's someone who gets power politics, and he has triangulated what narratives work domestically and also carve out a space for India on the world stage.
And I think in some ways, India's been actually conducting rather a skillful foreign policy in navigating this far more complicated world. I mean, it still has its relationship with Russia, but as I mentioned at the start of the episode, they've also developed an ever increasingly strong security and economic relationship with the US. They are cooperating in the Quad to manage the threat that they see from China. And then in another astonishing development, I mean, what was really interesting about the interview with Indrani is we didn't really talk about Pakistan or Kashmir or any of the issues that used to preoccupy the British High Commission when I was posted there. I mean, India has sort of emerged from out of its South Asia region and is now seen as a player on the world stage, not a country that is purely defined by its relationship with Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka and its immediate neighborhood. Those are real achievements. I also want to note that the India-Israel relationship has been developing for many decades that preceded Modi. In fact, the outreach between India and Israel began under the Narasimha Rao government. So what we're seeing today is a continuation of trends that were beginning to develop at the start of the 21st century. But I also think the fact that Modi is able to get away with this balancing act is because the world is a little more uncertain and the US does not have the same authority that it used to have before. Countries like India feel they can challenge and push back and represent their own interests, right?
Yes, neopopulism can pay, and it works in certain instances. I think Modi is like other neopopulists. His policies are calculated only to stay in power, but they're not really calculated about India's long-term interests, because Russia's dominance in the long term, or Putin's ability to stay in power, that's not going to help India. All it is that, like Orban or Netanyahu, neopopulists benefit from an uncertain world. India has really been a beneficiary of chaos in the global stage. Yes, people might have noticed that a Canadian national Sikh activist was murdered in Canada. But did we sanction the Indians? Did we cut off trade and say, no, you can't do like a Putin style, send your goons to murder a political opponent? No, we kind of let them get away with it. That's not the only thing that's going on in terms of India. There's a neo-populist consolidation, an opposition politician in advance of the 2024 Indian presidential elections. And I'm talking about someone who, I apologize if I pronounce his name incorrectly, Kejriwal. He was the chief minister of Delhi's capital territory. He was arrested this month of March, and they made up some trumped up corruption charges. Germany has protested it. The US has made a statement. Britain has made a statement. This is standard neo-populist. Don't let your opponents run. Do you know what I mean? This is closer to taking a page out of Putin's book. But the world being how it is, are we really in a position, Alex, to have any moral authority as well as the practical ability to intervene in India's democracy? No, we're not.
I'm not sure I 100% agree that India benefits from chaos in the world. I mean, I remember being posted there at the height of our intervention in Afghanistan, and the Indians were absolutely fearful about what would happen when we left Afghanistan and they would deal with the consequences on their doorstep. And I'm sure I've told this anecdote before. They said, we know you're going to leave. My talking points were to say, no, we're absolutely committed to the long haul. We're not going to abandon Afghanistan. And India was right. I mean, I'm not sure we're doing a particularly brilliant job of sustaining order in the world. And I don't think it helps India. And I don't blame India for looking out for its own interests. And then Modi's record. I mean, before the interview, you and I were talking about some of the more troubling aspects of what's been going on inside India under Modi. But there's also a good story. And again, Indrani touched on it. I mean, the investments in infrastructure. When I was in Delhi, the airport there was an absolute disaster. It was one of the worst airports I've ever had to travel through. And now there are all these effective new airports. The roads and highways, it used to take hours to get from Delhi to Jaipur. You could now get there on a new road in under, an hour and a half or something. Then the fact that there are digital payments to transmit welfare payments directly to the poor, often to the women, bypassing the men who might waste that money. I mean, that has transformed people's lives. There have been over 35 million houses that have been built for the poor. So I think there are things that Modi has really done for India, and that's why he has won this approval. He has put India on the global map. He has navigated this sort of multipolar world quite skillfully, and he has created this sense of momentum in India. What it hasn't done is trickled down entirely to the poorest sectors. It has enhanced inequality, and it has built on the back of this very poisonous ideology that is very divisive. So I think he's undermining some of what India was constructed on its independence, this pluralistic democracy, and that may have long-term effects.
Yes, that was very well put, Alex. And I'm going to just say that makes him very similar to Viktor Orban and Benjamin Netanyahu, both of whom are very skilled operators, for lack of a better term. But let's get to the question of, should India do more on the global stage? Is it an orderer or a disorderer? To me, India should be not just an orderer, the global leader or a top global leader. Democracy will only win if India is on its side and fighting for order and deriving new institutions and mechanisms to deal with things like climate change and tax havens. And I do have hope a future India with different leadership could play that role.
So my answer to the question is, I don't think India is a disorderer, and I think it does help contribute to some ordering. I think it's a good thing that it's in the BRICS. I think it is a moderating influence in the BRICS. It has been moving in some ways on climate change. And I feel it can be a really important power in the Indo-Pacific. I feel that India's rise is never going to be completely in the trajectory that we ideally might wish it to be. I think it is reflective of a changing world where power is shifting a little bit from an explicitly US-led world order to one that is more nuanced, and where countries like India are going to sustain relationships with countries that we find problematic. It is noticeable that Indrani said they are trying to reduce their dependence on Russian technology and defense, and I hope that continues. I think the fact that India is a democracy remains absolutely critical. I see it as a friend, I see it as a potential partner, and I see it being an awkward and contrarian one for many, many years to come.
I like this term contrarian, but I wonder if India really is still a democracy at this moment. There is an extent to which, when the media moguls are connected to a particular political ideology, and then you have oligarchic billionaires who also support it, and the second most important religious community is stigmatized, we're in a position which is not so dissimilar to what Orban has done in Hungary and what Netanyahu has sadly also been able to pull off in Israel-Palestine. So I'm all for India playing a global role, and I'm okay with a world where ordering isn't done entirely inside the Beltway. In the mid-21st century, there cannot be a world where Washington orders the universe. Delhi's going to have to play a large role. But the Delhi that I want to do that ordering can't be one which is so cynically neopopulist, stirring up hate for Muslims and really capitalizing off of other people's suffering.
I consulted my Bible, Freedom House, before this episode and see that India is rated as partly free. It scores 66 out of 100, and it scores highly for its elections, that there are free and fair elections that are generally well conducted and take place regularly. It scores much worse on some of its social issues and individual rights issues, and it's got worse on independence of institutions, especially the judiciary. So I think there are some warning signals there, but that critical factor of the elections is absolutely essential. And I think the end point here is really, can Congress get its act together? The original party around India's independence that shepherded its early decades, the party of Nehru and Gandhi, has really collapsed. And they are clinging to their association with the Gandhi family, and that is holding Congress back. And what India needs is a revitalized Congress party who can come up with a narrative and a platform and a policy and a set of new young leaders that offer an effective challenge to the BJP. And part of the reason for the BJP's rise is because of the weakness of the Congress party in its current incarnation. So democracy can remain India's salvation, but it requires a competent opposition.
Well said, from your mouth to Vishnu's ears.
I hope India becomes more of an orderer, and I hope India helps us order the disorder. And if you want to help us order the disorder, you can tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every new episode launches.
And for all of you mega orderers out there, this Thursday, Alex and I are going to have a chat-a-thon. We are going to discuss life in the US, life in the UK, how I'm, assimilating and fitting in here, what's more convenient, and the horrors of builders and trying to get insurance for your car in the United Kingdom.
And finally, you can read more about today's topic by subscribing to our excellent Substack, written by Jason. To check it out, just follow the links in our show notes.
But although I write it, I sometimes draw on your punchy commentary, Alex, and great preparation for these episodes. So thank you for that. But
thank you,
even
Jason.
Bigger thanks to our producer, George McDonough, and our executive producer, Neil Fern.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you have an orderly week.